Robert Maxwell, billionaire, friend of royalty, member of parliament, father to Ghislaine Maxwell, with a media empire to compare to Murdoch's, and a litigious hubris to compare with Donald Trump's. In his own time, he was both these men rolled into one. Today, the name Maxwell almost always appears alongside another, Epstein, but it has always been synonymous with controversy, intrigue, corruption, espionage, and a byword for the criminal underbelly of the elites. All of which Robert Maxwell used to cheat and buy his way to power and status in the United Kingdom, until his untimely and mysterious death in the Atlantic Ocean after falling overboard the yacht named after his favourite daughter, the Lady Ghislaine. Why do the men in Ghislaine Maxwell's life often seem to die shrouded in mystery, taking secrets with them? If he was so big, why don't we hear about him today, and why did his empire disappear overnight? How much was Ghislaine Maxwell's character shaped by her father? And did she make use of his connections to create the circle of depravity that surrounded her and Epstein? All questions which will be explored in this video. Robert Maxwell was born Jan Ludwig Hyman Benjamin Hock into a poor Jewish family in the frontier village of
Slatinské Doly
in 1923, a border town between Czechoslovakia and the USSR, and experienced the full force of the war and calamity of the 20th century, changing hands 5 times in the 1900s. His village was a shtetl, a Jewish village segregated from the surrounding non-Jewish people, described as a mandated island. Like many Yiddish families, his was huge, him being just one of 7 children. Perhaps this forced him to have a strong and outgoing character, something one would need to stand out or get attention among 6 other voices. Perhaps he took on a leadership role among them, explaining his domineering personality later on. Maybe being part of a segregated group gave him a morbidly fragile ego, like so many people who have been humiliated one too many times in their life. Questions which sadly can only be speculated on, as by the end of the Second World War, he was the only person left alive who remembered his own childhood, and was rarely interested in discussing it. Because in 1939 he fled his home, leaving his family behind. When the Nazis occupied Czechoslovakia, he fled first to France, then to England, where he fought for the Czech army in exile in the Normandy campaigns, earning him the British Military Cross for bravery, something of which he'd frequently brag. It was only after the war was over that he discovered that not only had his parents and every one of his 6 siblings, but his entire shtetl had been annihilated by the Germans. He said of it later, it's as if they had never existed. Whether or not this ambitious and exceptionally driven personality planned on returning to his small border town when he first left, there was now nothing left there for him anyway. He became a British citizen in 1946 and changed his name to Robert Maxwell, severing himself completely from his old life. In the wreckage of the Thousand-Year Reich, the people of Berlin scrounged for day-to-day goods, often turning to the black market. The soldiers of the occupying powers, most of whom weren't exactly rich themselves, took to supplying this demand themselves, and so flourished a lucrative black market. Maxwell was one of the first to smell profit amid the war-torn and desperate Berliners, this hungry social climber hitting the ground running with his first business venture, just as the smoke was clearing over Europe. Acting as a conduit between the British and Soviet occupation zones, he smuggled mostly cigarettes and other basic goods. And as a Jew who grew up in a shtetl, perhaps he revelled in his new position of superiority over the once proud Germans. But perhaps there's also some sort of desperation in it, which put him above the rest. After all, unlike most of his comrades, he wasn't looking forward to going back home anytime soon. He didn't have a choice. He needed money, lots of it now, but as we'll see, it would never be enough. Growing upon the connections he made between the British and Soviets, he founded his first real business, Pergamon Press, publisher of scientific magazines. Uniquely, it had exclusive publishing rights in the Soviet Union itself, as well as Western Europe. The business model was beautifully simple. Buy cheap publishing rights from the USSR and sell them for a premium in the West. This business venture may seem like a sudden leap. Did he really make all that money from selling cheap second-hand cigarettes? Of course not, but we'll get more into this a little later. Just use this timestamp if you want answers. But for now, just know that by 1960 it had made him a pretty wealthy man. By this point, he was settled into the life of an upper-class Brit, so much so even that he was elected a Member of Parliament for Buckingham in the 1964 election as a Labour MP. Another leap. He made no secret that he had ambitions of becoming the Prime Minister, but his political venture proved short-lived, and he lost his seat in 1970, and was unable to get it back, cutting his political career short. This came soon after his ambitions had been cruelly rejected in another of his insatiable vanity projects, to become London Fleet Street's top dog, a real media baron. Not one of the top dog. To this end, he attempted to buy the News of the World, a failing but notable tabloid. This would give him recognition. During his short time in Parliament, he had already started framing himself as a top media baron, who could do his politician colleagues plenty of favours in the papers. Alas, the owners were disgusted at the idea of a Czech with socialist views acquiring their paper. They even went as far as publicly ridiculing Maxwell in an opinion piece, scoffing that News of the World is a British paper, as British as roast dinner, let's keep it that way. They went on to sell it to the Australian baron, Rupert Murdoch. In 1970, the year Maxwell lost his seat, Murdoch also bought The Sun, another paper Maxwell had been interested in. This wasn't the only blow he had suffered in the 60s. The board of Pergamon Press, his first business, forced him out amid a financial scandal involving the manipulation of the price of shares, his first and by absolutely no means his last scandal. He would reacquire Pergamon in 1974. He forgot little of this, his lowest moment, when it seemed his wildest ambitions had been checked. He certainly didn't forget the enemies, who hardly even knew he existed, but he would make absolute sure he got their attention soon. The 70s were spent licking his wounds, and a restless social climber like Maxwell would make conscious effort to make good on the time he lost when the 80s came round. Finally, he acquired his first newspaper, the Mirror Group, and could now take his revenge on Murdoch. Never again would he lose. Never again would he be humiliated. What followed remains the most ruthless war between two media barons in British history, if not certainly the most well publicised. It was Maxwell who fired the opening salvo in a well publicised press conference, days after acquiring the Mirror, in which he openly declared that he would dethrone Murdoch's recently created media empire. To this end, he founded Maxwell Media Corp, comparable to Sky News in its own day. At this point, you should be noticing a pattern in Maxwell, that enough was never enough for him. It wasn't just enough to make a living in post-war Berlin, he had to become a millionaire. It wasn't enough to just go into politics, he had to become Prime Minister. Now it wasn't enough to just own a newspaper, he had to own the best media empire in the country, scratch that the world. Through the 80s, through costly takeovers, he snapped up papers across the globe, from Germany and Bulgaria, and even in New York. He branched out into tech and grew his existing publishing empire. If the 80s was the age of Trump for Americans, it was the age of Maxwell in Britain, because it wasn't enough for him to just own these, not enough to be rich. People had to know all about it too. One of the reasons he often kept a camera crew following his every move when he entered the office, curating his public image, that of the eccentric British millionaire. All the while, as a former associate says, he made his entire career at this time a competition with Murdoch. If he owned 5 big papers, he would ask, how many did Murdoch currently own? Maxwell's career was symbolic of the 80s. It seemed like it could only get bigger and better, until it didn't. As the 90s began, so did a recession in Britain. Suddenly, the banks weren't willing to loan him any more money until he paid back what he already owed them. This revealed a key weakness in his empire. His rapid and aggressive spending spree meant he never really had much cash on him. It was all in assets. So now that he couldn't borrow any more money, he did the only thing he could to keep the empire running. He started selling bits of it off. This would have been a severe blow to his pride. He couldn't slow down. That meant losing, and he refused to lose again. This attitude proved to be his and his whole empire's undoing. Robert Maxwell was reported missing around the Canary Islands on his yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, on 5th of November 1991. His body was later found by the search party. He'd fallen overboard sometime in the early morning. After his death, it surfaced he had plundered some £400 million from his own employees' pension funds, to pay off his debts and keep his empire running, keeping it up with Murdoch's. And the short-lived Maxwell empire disintegrated completely. Recall earlier in the video his sudden career boost from smuggler to entrepreneur. Well, in reality, it was from smuggler to spy to entrepreneur. You see, after World War II, there was no world peace. Instead, the Cold War began, and Maxwell's homeland, Czechoslovakia, fell under communist rule. He enlisted with the NKVD, later known as the KGB, and became an informant. The KGB must have thought of him as a valuable asset, being as he was a recent British citizen and soldier. However, he immediately then went over to MI6, the British equivalent of the CIA, and became a double agent. It was here, according to a former MI6 official, that he made an extremely unusual request, that they should give him the funds for a new business. Amazingly, they agreed, and so he founded, with MI6 money, Pergamon Press. The selling point for his funders being he had exclusive publishing rights in Eastern Europe, thanks to his KGB connections, and since it was a science magazine, it gave them valuable information. It was in this way he became an informal channel between the two countries. But the MI6 noted something else. He wasn't just a double, but a triple agent too, his other loyalty being to Mossad and Israel, this likely being the case as early as 1948, when he was still an enemy of the UK. The following details about Maxwell's life and his many loyalties go into the speculative, pieced together from various reports and claims from former intelligence officials and whistleblowers, but some are all but confirmed facts. What is beyond a doubt is that Maxwell had deep ties with Mossad. Former US intelligence official John Loftus believes it began in 1948, during Israel's first and most desperate war with the Arabs. At this time, their survival as a country was far from certain. Uniquely, communist Czechoslovakia armed them with Soviet jets, which enabled them to gain air superiority. Some believe it was Maxwell's covert help in smuggling these arms that helped Israel win their first and most crucial victory, but the concrete proof of this is sparse. More concretely is Maxwell's active efforts to suppress any and all negative press about Israel during the first few tenuous decades of its existence, leveraging the many papers he owned. Now, this isn't particularly unique among newspaper owners, but sometimes, as was his nature, he went above and beyond. In 1986, the height of Robert Maxwell's career, Israeli nuclear technician and defector Mordechai Vanunu fled to the UK with sensitive information on his country's illegal weapons program. He approached the Mirror with this story, only to then be kidnapped on British soil and smuggled back to Israel, where he was imprisoned for the next 18 years. Vanunu's story is well known. Less well known is Maxwell's implication in it. According to former Mossad agent Ari Ben Menashe, he was personally involved in his betrayal to Mossad. Finally, there's the infamous Promise software incident. During one of his spending sprees, in which he seemed to summon money from thin air, he had purchased numerous tech companies, one of which distributed Promise, mainly used by secure government facilities. However, it was found that a bugged version of the software had been sold en masse and was being used by governments, financial institutions, military bases, and nuclear research sites across the world, USA and USSR alike, all containing a backdoor used by Mossad. Allegedly, these all led back to units sold by Robert Maxwell, but the link was never proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. The story of Maxwell's intelligence connections ends with his untimely death on the Atlantic in 1991. The accepted theory is that while urinating over the edge of his yacht, as he often did, he had a heart attack and fell. But of course, there's more. Unable to pay his debts, the increasing opaqueness of his holdings, and the unravelling of his pension fund conspiracy all led some to believe he'd killed himself. But his son has asserted this just wasn't in his makeup, and from what we've learnt about him, this is true. Maxwell would never accept defeat. Now for the obvious question, was he murdered? Or more accurately, assassinated? Let's describe the events from this point of view. On calm waters, somehow Robert Maxwell fell. He was found 3 days later with some prior injuries. His crew kept changing their stories, and numerous logs from that night had been misplaced. This all at a time when he was in hot water. If someone wanted him dead, they must have bribed members of his crew, or infiltrated it. Could it be a business partner? No, this doesn't make any sense. They'd be shooting themselves in the foot. It wasn't the banks. They easily could have seized his assets to pay off his debts. It must have been one of his intelligence links. The going theory here is that it was none other than Mossad. At this point, with his legal troubles, he would have become a liability, rather than an asset. And with his triple dealings, would not be seen as trustworthy. Anonymous tip-offs from within Mossad, which should obviously be treated with extreme caution, claim in his desperation he had attempted to blackmail the Israeli government for a large loan to help pay off his debts. So somehow, they infiltrated or bribed his yacht, and pushed him overboard. This actually makes some sense to his character. He was desperate, and would have done anything in his power not to lose to Murdoch. And since he had played all sides, none of the other agencies would feel any obligation to warn this reckless billionaire of the plot against him. Robert Maxwell, the man born in 1946 with no roots, friends or loyalties, would have died as he'd chosen to live. It's a great theory, a great story, but for now, Robert Maxwell had a heart attack and fell overboard to Lady Ghislaine on the 5th of November 1991. The British Foreign Office believed him to be a triple agent and a thoroughly bad character, and almost certainly financed by Russia. British politician George Galloway has branded him one of the worst criminals of the century, and certainly this has remained a broad consensus since his death. But playing all sides would have made perfect sense to him. After all, it meant he couldn't lose. In many ways, the childhood home he tried so hard to distance himself from, even going as far as changing his name, the little shtetl which changed hands so many times during the 20th century, was strangely symbolic of him. Its roots and loyalties lay nowhere. Perhaps the death of everyone he knew in that life gave him a strange sense of liberation. He now had no loyalties, owed nobody anything. He was his own man. But to me at least, it seems he had an acute sense of this homelessness. He chose as his new home country the UK, and strove to be accepted not just into Britain, but into its upper class. After all, it wasn't enough to just be British. He had to be exceptionally British. To this end, he selected a wonderful Oxford country manor as his home. A home which curiously had no Jewish icons to speak of. Little did his new aristocrat friends know he didn't even own this home. It was leased from Oxford Council. It was all show, like much of his career was. It was the mimicry of the upper class. Maxwell, being such a cunning person, would have known he would never truly be one of them. He was new money. But his children weren't new money, and he knew this. His children, especially his favourite daughter, Ghislaine, were enlisted in the Maxwell family charm offensive of the upper classes. He was determined to build a dynasty. Ghislaine would become an expert in the schmoozing of the elites, and we'll discuss this later in the video if you skip to this timestamp. One thing people noticed about his work habits was the chaos of his office. It was the world's biggest one-man show. The level of obsessive control he ran his multinational empire with extended to middle managers being so terrified of not consulting him, they'd ask what colour he wanted bathrooms painted. This led him favouring the promotion of his sons to leading positions. He also rivals Trump as one of the most litigious businessmen of the century, spending as much time filing and fighting lawsuits as he did growing his empire. When a journalist attempted to write a biography on him, which included groundbreaking info relating to his intelligence connections, Maxwell prevented its release by suing every single bookshop and library which sold it. In this case, he actually won, the author having no way of releasing it. He was only able to publish it after his untimely death. Maxwell was also exceptionally misogynistic, even for the time. During his time in Parliament, his office was staffed by male assistants, and he complained men have too much independence, while female assistants become an extension of the boss. Maxwell's wife, Elizabeth, was described by those who met her as like a little mouse, who, needless to say, turned the other cheek to his extremely public flirtations. All things which would have been noticed by his children, including daughter Ghislaine. Ghislaine Maxwell was the favourite child of Robert. This is widely agreed upon. She doted on him, more so than most spoiled rich girls do on their father. In public she clung to him, and much like a certain other businessman, he showed her off to friends and camera alike, calling her beautiful and sexy. Damn, he really is like Britain's Trump. This wasn't just idle bragging though. As we saw earlier, she was an important weapon in his arsenal. She was a part of the Maxwell charm offensive into the upper classes, and she did everything she could to impress, to help her father. He was known as a bit of a crook in the business world, knew money, and was thus only tolerated as an important man by the upper class. Although Ghislaine was a different matter. She had inherited all his natural charisma, but had been bred and trained in the upper class world, and Robert intentionally inserted her into his network of connections, to the end of building a dynasty. Those who knew her said she had a dirty sense of humour, like her father, and like him, didn't have much of a sense of personal space, being extremely touchy and physical with people. One party she held with her new high society pals involved blindfolding all the men and lining up the female guests, herself included, in front of them. She invited the men to grope their breasts, using signs to try and guess whose it was they were touching. When her father died, the ground beneath her feet was abruptly swept away. While her brothers struggled in the courts, she fell on hard times for the first time in her life. That was until she found someone else, another man whose services as a high society schmoozer she could lend herself to. Jeffrey Epstein. Like her father, he was new money, someone who could never be fully accepted into that world as one of them, but the dynamic between them was the same. He had the money to fund her lifestyle, she had the connections and charisma. Unlike her father though, he was more reserved and hung to the back of parties, while she thrust herself deep into the centre of attention. During one such occasion, she told a guest her name, to which the reply was a laughing, "How could I even spell that? It sounds like gasoline." Ghislaine laughed, her usual laugh, and replied, "That's what Jeffrey always calls me. I'm gasoline and he's the match." Using the connections that her father had lent to her, ones he had fought for in his long years of ruthless social climbing, she would in turn lend to the new man in her life, ones he'd put to even more sinister use than Robert Maxwell.